All right. Well, thank you, Brian. And I hope everyone had a good lunch. I know that was kind of short, but we're trying to cover a lot of ground today. So as Brian said, I'm going to go ahead and continue with application methods, and we'll talk about foliar sprays and liner soaks. Yeah. Right, let's start with foliar sprays. Foliar sprays are probably the most often used application method for plant growth regulators. We're still doing smaller numbers of plants and a little more by hand, although we're seeing more of an increase in the use of irrigation systems, boom systems for application of PGRs and a more of a sprinch or drench kind of method, but still we're doing a lot of sprays. So let's talk about that. And when we talk about sprays or any of our application methods, when we talk about the soil active plant growth regulators, Brian mentioned the paclobutrizoles, the uniconazoles, and the top floor, those in particular are very soil active. And so the volume of application is very critical to the activity of that plant, the activity of that PGR in that plant. And the uniformity of your crop is going to depend very much on the uniformity of your application. And we'll talk a little bit too about environmental conditions, how that affects the efficacy of your PGRs as well. So first of all, let's talk about volume and why that's critical. If you've done any of my presentations, you've seen this slide before, but it is one of the most dramatic. Back when we first started working with bonsai with paclobutrazole, the application volume was kind of iffy. You know, there were still people talking about spray to runoff or spray to glistening, the kind of terms that we used when we were just using the foliar applications of products like diminizide. So this was hollyhock that was treated shortly after planting the plugs into the 4-inch pots, 50 parts per million at the label recommended volume, 1 gallon per 200 square feet. But we also applied twice that volume, which was really more comparable to spray to runoff. And we had a good bit of that runoff spray accumulating in the media in that pot. And because of the soil activity of paclobutrazole, we had much more growth regulation in this container. We effectively applied 100 parts per million because we doubled the volume. But we had even more than twice the growth regulation because of the high activity of that material in the root zone. So soil active materials are very quickly taken up by the plant from the roots, and you have to take into account the volume of your application. I visited a grower who was very pleased with the response that he got to 10 parts per million Sumagic on his hydrangeas. And he pulled out these two plants, and I said, wow, yeah, you got a lot of response. And he goes, no, no, no. These were both treated with 10 parts per million Sumagic. And my comment was, well, we need to talk about your application methods because they're definitely not uniform. You need to pay a lot of attention to making your spray applications evenly to an area, not to the plants. When we were doing foliar sprays of foliar materials, we would go plant to plant, making sure we got good coverage on individual plants. You can't do that with a soil active material. You need to use a constant volume over the area. And that also means you need to monitor your equipment to make sure that you're also getting a uniform output from that equipment. So a lot of growers have countered that by using multiple applications. We see this particularly in the north. It reduces the risk of overdose because you start with a lower rate, a lower part per million than you would expect to need, but you can adapt to variable growing conditions or a delay in the market or an early market if you have a little more control. It basically gives the grower more control. And you'll hear people talk about watering in, and this is making multiple applications of very low rates, typically through the irrigation system. And this is the ultimate in growth control through multiple applications, and it really is an art. There's very little science behind that one. That takes art and experience. But let me give you a few examples of using multiple applications. This is Echinacea ruby star, and the recommended rate that I found on charts in some of our previous work was 45 parts per million as a single application. So we took half that rate, made that application alone, or we made that application twice at 2-week intervals. And you can see that the single application of 22 parts per million probably was not sufficient growth regulation, whereas the two applications you have the additional tool of time. We did these at 2-week intervals. As a grower, you might look at that and say, no, it needs to be done at 10 days, 15 days, 20 days, 3 weeks. You have the control that we don't have if you're making a single application. A couple of other examples, again with sedum, autumn joy, the rate application recommended was 45 parts per million, but look what we got with half that rate. Excellent plant, excellent control, and excellent fill, whereas the 45 parts per million or 2 applications of 22 parts per million was a significant overdose. Top floor, similar results. The 75 parts per million gave us good control, not really enough with the 1 application of 37 parts per million. 2 applications, the timing probably needed to be different. But again, that's where your grower control comes in with multiple applications. This is an example with Monarda, Sumagic, 30 parts per million was a recommended rate. Half that, didn't touch it. 2 applications gave us good control. And what we find with a lot of our plant growth regulators, Brian mentioned that we get a lot of linear growth regulation with our perennials. That's what we want. We really would like to see a linear response, but often we see a saturation response as opposed to this would be our linear response where we actually get more growth control with higher rates. And usually there is a range where this is true, but usually not over the entire range that we might recommend for growth regulation. This is an example of salvia, a little bit out of focus there, but you can see we did have a linear response and we had growth control persisting through 4 weeks. But you would definitely need to come back and make a second application if you needed control beyond that. But if you have a linear response, then you have a good idea, you can predict what kind of growth regulation you're going to get based on what you got with a previous rate. And that's the value of having a linear response. The other thing is that we can decide what rate to use based on how long we want that control to last. If we are getting our plants in early and they're especially vigorous, or if they're not so vigorous, we're going to choose the rate based on how long we think we're going to have to hold them to market. You can see there's a significant difference in how much control we have with the higher rates as we hold those plants over time. A couple of other spray application notes. If you're using a PGR on a waxy leaf plant, there are surfactants that are available and labeled for some of the PGRs. Not all of them. It's very important to look at that PGR label and follow the label on that. Spray applications do have the most potential for delaying flowering if they're applied late in the crop in particular. And again, multiple applications are a good tool for you to use. The uniformity of the application produces a uniform response. And again, that volume does provide a tool. One of the ways we use that tool is as a sprinch. A sprinch is effectively a high volume spray, kind of a hybrid between your spray and your drench. Again, you're going to use this with soil active materials, so you actually get some of that extra material down into the root zone. You're going to apply that volume if you want to stay with spray equipment at 2 to 4 times the recommended spray volume. And you're going to reduce the rate, the part per million in the solution, by a comparable amount, typically 1/2 to 1/4 of the spray rate. These can be more effective than a foliar spray simply because you're getting more of that material down into the root zone where it is actively taken up by the plant. So a couple of notes on volume. The volume you're going to use does depend very much on the application method, spray versus a sprinch versus a drench, but it is critical to control because of that uniformity factor. But you can also use volume as an application tool. That is to say that you can increase the volume when you want to increase the dosage. For example, there are growers that will spray pansies with 15 parts per million Sumagic, but there are some cultivars that need additional control. They can simply come back with the same spray tank of 15 parts per million, treat those again, and they've effectively increased the dose to 30 parts per million. So again, you can use that. Remember that the increased volume increases the availability of the material in the root zone, where most of these PGRs are more actively taken up than they are with foliar sprays. So keep in mind you can increase the activity there. So let's talk just a minute about environmental conditions. I'm going to talk specifically about the plant at the time of application. You definitely want what we call a happy plant. And I know that you all know what a happy plant is. It's a turgid plant grown under moderate temperature where it's thriving essentially. And the turgid unstressed plant will be the best at absorbing the plant growth regulators, any of the materials that you put on the leaf surface. So we look at time of day as it affects application, basically on how it affects the plant stress. If we reduce the plant stress, apply at a time or under conditions, cloudy conditions or such that reduce plant stress, will reduce phytotoxicity and increase the uptake of the material. Now, there was a question about day length, and I'll throw that in here because it doesn't really fit later, but we can discuss it again at the end if we want to. When we talk about day length, temperature, soil temperature, air temperature, any of those conditions and how they affect PGR efficacy, we're really talking about how they affect plant growth. And this really gets back to the art of applying plant growth regulators. Your goal is to apply a plant growth regulator to counter rapid growth in the plant. So if you're growing them under cooler conditions, under drier conditions, under lower light conditions, those are all going to affect the amount of plant growth regulator you need. And so it's the same day length. If you're using day length to push that plant to bulk up the vegetative growth, you're going to need more PGR than if you're in the flowering stage. So you have to look at the plant growth and how you're pushing the plant or holding it back and use the PGR to complement that, as opposed to there's no set rule on that. You have to make it fit with the art of growth regulation. All right, let's move on to liner soaks, and we'll take any questions as we get there. But liner soaks, again, we're talking about using soil active plant growth regulators, and we're talking about early control of vigorous crops. It is a very flexible treatment because you can treat one day and plant the next or a couple days later, so you can eliminate issues with your restricted entry interval. But your goal is not to provide season-long growth control of that crop. It's to provide baseline and early control of vigorous crops. You can always come back and make additional treatments later if you need to. And essentially we're talking about any kind of a method that saturates the root zone, the root ball, before those plants are planted into their final container. Most of this work was done at the University of Florida. Came up with a very nice list of guidelines on using liner soaks. You're basically dipping the root ball in the solution. You want that root ball to be ready for irrigation, a dry plug. They found that across the flat, based on them being ready for irrigation, as long as you don't have wilting going on, you can get pretty uniform uptake of the material. The time in the solution is not critical. Anywhere from 30 seconds, that's enough to saturate the plug, up to 2 minutes. The main thing is to develop a protocol and be consistent with that protocol. You can plant these immediately, or as I said, you can hold them so you get past that REI, or you can hold them for a couple of days if you need to, without affecting the growth regulation response. The other thing is that there's no loss of effectiveness of that dip solution. In other words, the PGR is not being taken up selectively from that water. So you can use that solution, you can dispose of that solution by applying it as a drench onto other labeled crops. So it's an easy cleanup. There's also less potential for delay of flowering as compared to an overhead drench or a spray application. So let's look at a couple of examples. This is some Russian sage that we treated with bonsai, 2 to up to 10 parts per million. This is at 5 weeks after application. And again, you can see that we've got really nice control, early control of those plants. And you can look at them at 8 weeks after and see that the lower rates have definitely grown out. So again, based on when you're planting, how long you need to hold them, you might choose your rates a little higher if you're talking about earlier, or if you're talking about using these plants in a mixed container. The nice thing about these is that treating the root ball of these will control the growth of these individual plants with very little effect on surrounding plants. The material itself does not leach out of that root ball. A couple of other examples, Gara Pink Fountain. You can see we got a good response. This is at 2 weeks after treatment. You can see that our control is already getting very leggy and out of bounds. Looking at 4 and 8 weeks, you can see we're talking about the effective rate and giving you the amount of control that you're looking for. Again, work with it based on how long you want the control to hold, but recognize it's easier to come back and treat again than it is to take it away or treat with one of those growth promoters that we talked about. Monarda is one that was not so responsive. You can see up to 16 parts per million at 4 weeks after treatment. We still had very little growth regulation. You can see that we are getting into very long internodes. So again, it's very cultivar and species dependent as far as the responses you're going to get. But one of the things we found with some of these crops where we had a lot of trouble getting control with the spray application, this is Calamagrostis. You can see with the spray application of up to 60 parts per million Sumagic, we had very little growth control. However, look at the effect of the liner soaks. This again is at 6 weeks after treatment. We had very nice control, and this was for a propagator that was trying to hold these plants and wanted to reduce the number of times he needed to prune them back, and got very nice control up to about 6 or 8 weeks after treatment. Same kind of results with Miscanthus, up to 5 parts per million. We had control actually up to 12 weeks. So these were plants that are really hard to control with spray applications, but they were very responsive to the liner soaks. Again, you're getting that plant growth regulator in the area of the plant that is most active in taking up the material. And then just one more example, looking at spray applications versus the liner soak. Rudbeckia is very responsive to Concise as a spray application, but you can see at the liner soaks it was even much more effective, much more active. And so we have a lot of response here with the liner soaks. A little more persistence in some crops than in others. Again, it's something you're going to have to work out a lot of these trials and rates under your own conditions. So just in summary, you have to pay attention to your application methods, whether that's a spray application or the liner soaks. Develop a protocol and stick with it. Train your employees, have just a few people doing spray applications. It really is hard to develop a consistent application method, and so you really want to train someone who does that on a regular basis so that they are consistent from one time to the next, as well as just going through a house. There are cultivar differences in response to all of these growth regulators. This is an example with delphinium. We're talking about piccolo, paclobutrazole sprays. You can see that 60 parts per million gave us a nice control with the spray application, whereas Black Knight at 100 parts per million gave us absolutely no control at all. Again, you're going to have to do some of these trials for yourself. There are a lot of resources out there. Brian's mentioned a couple of the guides that we've developed, but there are a lot of different resources. You just have to pay attention to the label recommendations, pay attention to the warnings on those labels. And as Brian mentioned, and I want to reinforce, especially with the perennials, there seem to be a lot of variation in the effects from different areas of the country. So you need to ask, and a couple people already have, where do those rates come from? Higher rates are used in the south. In the north, we're going to use 1/2 to 1/4 the rates that are used in the south. So you really need to know where those rates come from. The Fine Americas guides that Brian mentioned, you may have gotten the new one in the Grower Talks, but as Brian mentioned, they are also on our eGrow website, and you can download those as well. So I think I'm ready for any questions, Brian.
Okay, Joyce. So far, you must have just done a fantastic job explaining everything, because nobody has typed in any questions yet. So if any of you do have questions, please get those typed into the chat box here in the next minute or two.
I just talked so fast I couldn't keep up.
we do have some time here for questions. Please type those in if you have questions about foliar sprays and liner soaks for Joyce. Again, just to reiterate here, there are some questions earlier on about the sempervirens, and Brian Whipker did post on the chat portion of the control panel of the PDF or the link onto the Fine America's website that you can find that information there. There has been several different questions about top floor G, and there hasn't. Joyce couldn't find anything on the web about that, with the exception of what CPro has posted on their website. Here's a question: do you have any specific information on petunia liner soaks for wave petunias? Which PGRs and what liner rates might work the best?
I personally don't, but I bet you Brian does.
Let's see if Whipker's paying attention and is ready to answer a question. Brian, do you have a comment on the wave petunia liner soaks? He's not ready.
I'm ready.
There you go.
I heard the question, by the way. This headset goes down to 0 every time I plug it back in. So I think I'm talking to someone, but I'm only talking to myself. Off the top of my head, I don't remember that. So after I get done with the next presentation, I'll look up that information because I have some rates. But it's been a few years since I did the petunia work, and I'll come back and either post it or bring it in on the question. So I'll postpone that question. Liner soaks for petunia, and we didn't do waves, but it should be pretty well similar. So I'll address that in a few minutes.
Okay. So Joyce, back to liner soaks on perennials. If liner soaks were applied to perennials and then grown and then overwintered, will the liner soak eventually lose efficacy? And then will you have to spray again with a foliar spray or come back with a substrate drench?
The question is basically how long will it last in the plant, and that's going to depend entirely on what kind of rate you use. I will tell you on that Russian sage that I showed you, the liner dips up to the 10 and parts per million and higher. We actually planted those out into the landscape that fall, and they were still showing growth responses the following spring. So yes, it depends on the rate you're using. I would not recommending a rate that gave you that much control, because you really don't know how it's going to respond the following year. That's kind of asking a little too much as far as predictability. But yes, it could.
Okay. And what about the use of fungicides? Will that affect liner dips?
I have not done those trials or seen where anyone has done those trials, but my guess would be that there would not be an issue with that. Do recognize that you're dipping multiple plants in the same solution. So if you have any issues with root diseases, I would not be doing a liner dip because of simply the potential of spreading those diseases to the other plants that you dip. But as far as any interaction with fungicides, I am not aware of any.
Okay, and again with liner soaks, what about how long does the active ingredient stay effective once you've mixed it up? So in other words, can you save the solution that you mixed up today and use it today or a little bit later in the week?
I'm not aware of any actual research on that. Sometimes your labels will tell you whether or not a material is stable for any length of time. I would go by what the label says as far as holding the material over after it's mixed. Recognize that you are introducing contaminants into this dip solution, so I would not expect it to hold as long as a clean sprayer of, PGR solution. But as far as most of these active ingredients, not counting ethylene, which you're not going to use this for anyway, well, actually you are, but not counting ethylene, that activity is pretty stable in solution for a while. I wouldn't go too long, but overnight, I think you could probably have the same activity the following day.
Okay. Any information on tank mixes or combo mixes of PGRs when using liner soaks?
I am not aware of any tank mix combos. That may be something we'll look at as we move forward with additional liner studies, looking at doing some growth regulation. I can't really see a point right now in tank mixes of growth retardants, but tank mixes with the branching enhancers, I could see that being an area that we'll be doing some research on in the next year or so.
Okay. Well, that seems to wrap up the questions that we have so far. We'll take a short 4 to 5 minute break, and then we'll come back with Brian Whipker talking about more application methods of plant growth regulators, focusing on substrate drenches and bulb soaks. Thank you, Joyce.
You're welcome.